Greetings all. My granddaughter led me here, told me it's a place where people who enjoy the spooky and the supernatural come to get their fix. She is helping me share my own story. Thought you folks might be tickled by it. These events came back to me at a recent family reunion. For fun, the last of us awake that night went in a circle and swapped our scariest moments stories. It was a good time, and as family members shared UFOs and creaky attics and near-death experiences, a trick floorboard in my mind popped up, exposing something my subconscious had long kept hidden, perhaps for my own good. So when their eyes all turned to Grammy K, likely expecting tales of past-era poverty or teenagers with tattoos, or the trials of childbirth, I leaned in and recounted to them the time I found a lost man in the woods. It caused quite a stir with the family, and at the insistence of my darling granddaughter, I share it with you now. This is something that happened when I was in my 20s. I won't embarrass myself by telling you how long ago that was, but suffice to say, I am quite a bit grayer above the ears these days. My first husband Ronald was a ranger, and for 5 years, we lived together on BLM land. Our regular backcountry excursions instilled in me a passion for the out-of-doors that was uncommon for a lady back then. Women might be found on a long walk or at a national park with their husband and children in tow, sure. But I was partial to taking a knapsack and charging into pure, isolating wilderness, often spending 2 or 3 days at a time following trails or inventing my own. Those excursions were often my greatest piece, especially after Ronald passed in our 6th year together. It was about a year after Ronald's passing and I was setting out for a 2-day trek in the Pacific Northwest. Washington or Oregon, I think, though that detail still remains beneath the floorboards. The trail looked attractive on the map, as it followed a river through a vast mountain valley that separated 2 small towns. I believe it had once served as a supply route between the towns before the road system came, after which it was merely a recreation trail, though not one to be taken lightly. The locals would warn all but the most avid outdoorsmen to avoid the route, as there was a point in the valley that required a difficult river fording. This ford occasionally took the lives of the cocky or the unprepared, sending their bodies bobbing downstream to be recovered by the town at the other end. But I reckoned I was avid enough. A friend dropped me off at the trailhead, as I had left my car parked in the town at the other end of the valley. I was immediately put to task by a steep hike up to a mountain saddle, and a precarious descent down the other side. It was past midday before I was rewarded with even terrain in the valley below. I managed the infamous river crossing cautiously and without incident, then resumed the trek on the opposite bank. The trail followed the river a few more miles before it leaned away, sending me from high grass and wildflowers into a forest of evergreens. The sun was beginning to angle towards the western range as the trees closed in behind me, shrouding my world in a gentle emerald dim. I made my way over the soft earth beneath the trees, grateful for the shade after a day exposed beneath the summer sun. The air was muted by a mossy quiet, and the limbs of the evergreens sliced the light into haphazard bars of gold. It was a dense, verdant, old-growth forest, the kind that feels like a cathedral, proud and reverent and secretive. I have always loved and sought such places. The trail took me downhill, and the shade grew darker still. There came a point where the pine needles underfoot fully obscured the path, and I paused, carefully peeking around evergreens to spot where it might pick up again, trying not to lose my place. I had my compass and map, but only food enough for a day and a half, and didn't want to be lost in the boondocks if I could help it. This was all before the age of the satellite phone, mind you. After a few moments of unsuccessful scanning, I decided to backtrack to see if there was perhaps a Y in the trail I had missed. I turned 180 degrees to find myself looking into the eyes of a man, some 10 or 12 feet behind me. I had no clue how long he had been there. My brain, in the panic of the moment, skipped right past surprise and landed directly on bewilderment. "Oh goodness, hello," I spit out, mostly on impulse. I am sure he could see the shock in my face, but he gave no sign of it. "Sure easy to get lost out here, isn't it?" he replied in simple, even tones. His appearance was the perfect outdoorsman, practically out of a sportsman's magazine of the day. Work boots and canvas pants, held up with suspenders that ran over a navy double-breasted shirt. The plaid cuffs of his sleeves were rolled up above the elbow, and the sleeping bag strapped atop his rucksack poked up from behind his head. Yet, despite his textbook appearance, he didn't feel like a woodsman to me. His bearded face was middle-aged, but the skin was deeply creased and drooping at the neck and jowls, as if much older. Beneath wild black eyebrows were grayish eyes that seemed unable to focus on any spot in particular. Splotches of sweat darkened the pits and neckline of his shirt, and he gave off a rank odor that disgusts me even in memory. He offered me a strained, toothy smile, as if he had heard descriptions of smiles but was trying it out for the first time. "It certainly could be," I replied with exaggerated politeness, recentering myself internally. "Sorry for my surprise, I didn't hear you come up behind me." The man ignored the comment. "Are you lost out here too?" he asked. His expression remained polite earnest, but behind the foggy gray eyes, I detected something else, something I couldn't put a word to. Instinctively, I began to take a mental inventory of what weapons I had at my disposal. The best I could come up with was my Swiss Army knife, which was unfortunately tucked into the bottom of my knapsack. I could hear Ronald's deep, stern voice echo in the back of my head somewhere saying, "You should be packing a gun, Christy. You never know what you'll run into." I shooed Ronald's ghost and its "I told you so" away and turned my focus back to the man. "Certainly not lost, no," I responded carefully, not wishing to make myself any more vulnerable than I already was. "But you said too. Are you lost out here?" The man rocked on his feet, his eyes scanning vacantly in my direction. "Yes, lost. People wander out here, get lost," he replied. His voice was gravelly, delivered in flat, dead tones. "But sometimes I find them wandering through the forest, stepping and breaking, trying to find their way. So I help them, take them back to the river, so they can follow it out. I can help you too. Help you find the river." At that, he set his empty eyes upon me, truly locking his with mine. His expression transformed into something equal parts pained and furious, as if I had betrayed him in some horrible, intimate way. A primordial part of me awoke and a wave of adrenaline screamed to sprint into the maze of evergreens surrounding us. But a firm, clear voice of instinct told me to stand still. So, like a mouse being fixed upon by a house cat, still I stood. "Well, I'm not lost, though I am sure this trail can be a bit of trouble for some. I certainly appreciate the offer though," I said, in the most friendly tones I could muster. Few sunbeams were making it through the trees overhead, and knew I needed to move things along. But I think I'd better get moving while I still have some light. I have some friends hiking in from the other end expecting to meet me at camp tonight, so I can't afford to get too off of schedule. This was a lie, of course, but I wanted him to think others would be coming along soon. That, I was expected. But inside I wished more then than ever that Ronald was with me again. The man practiced his disconcerting smile once more, and his eyes blissfully unfocused. "Yes, still have some light," he echoed in his staccato. "The walkers get lost, making little circles in the forest. If you lose the way, I'll lead you to the river." In the tension of the moment, I didn't process his words, but it was clear that something insidious glared out from behind them at me. "Oh, of course, thanks, I'll keep that in mind." "Happy trails," I practically shouted, eager to detach, and commenced a rigorous power walk in the direction I had left off at, unsure if I was continuing on the true trail or not. After a few dozen paces I began blessedly to see indications of the path and took back to it. A few minutes of concerted near jogging later, my heart thumping in my ears and my pack thumping against my back, I slowed to a walk and watched over my shoulder to see if the strange man was following me. I had put in some considerable distance, and in the greenish-dark murk of the forest, I saw nothing but ferns and evergreens. Then, coming around far back on the trail, there he was. Not necessarily following, I suppose, but walking in my same direction, staggering down the path about 60 yards behind me. He moved awkwardly, almost drunken, like someone learning to walk on a prosthetic. In the moment my eye caught him, his head snapped up, and even from that distance I could feel cold gray eyes locked to mine. And I knew then, it wasn't a coincidence. I was being followed. I whipped my face forward and picked my pace. The last miles of that day were hiked briskly and stressed. No matter how much speed I put into my pace, the man would always somehow catch up behind me down the trail, despite his disjointed walk. I would lose him for 5 or 10 minutes, then catch some sight or sound of him, persisting ever forward. And so I had no peace. Never breaking, often run jogging, but never able to get more than a few minutes of isolation before I would hear his feet cracking branches along the path, or see his dark silhouette come around a bend in the trail far behind me. The last tangerine rays of sun had faded from the forest floor when I realized I would have to stop. I was losing the last of my visibility, and although I was tempted, I knew that hiking in the pitch was foolish. Using my torch to find my way around would make me a beacon to the man in the night. But on the other hand, hiking blindly would mean almost certainly losing the trail, getting me no closer to escape, and could mean injury or death if I was unlucky. And I was not feeling lucky. Instead, I resolved to make my way as far off trail as I dared, quietly set up camp, and wait for the first light of daybreak to serve as a starter pistol for a mad dash to the end of the valley. I didn't love the plan, but no better ideas came to me. So I crept past the tree line, quiet as a fox, and gingerly set up my one-man pup tent behind a couple interlocked evergreens that stood vanguard between my camp and the direction of the trail. The spot was encircled by ferns and brambles, the best cover I could find. From amber dusk to pale moonlight, I had just enough light to see what I was doing as I moved quietly on sore legs and blistered feet. I didn't bother with dinner or coffee or any of my rituals typical of a trip to the backcountry. I scarcely remember drinking water. What I do remember is laying atop my sleeping bag, unwilling to constrict myself within it, fully dressed, with my Swiss Army knife clutched in my fist, the blade out and ready. I spent my time breathing evenly, staying silent, and listening. After a couple hours I began to calm. The man had never been more than about 15 minutes behind me down the trail, so if he was a tracker, he would have long since traced me to camp. If not a tracker, I suspected he had already overshot my camp, making a successful backtrack to my location near impossible. I was just beginning to form an estimate as to how long before daybreak when I heard movement in the woods. It was the snapping, cracking of something moving ponderously over the forest floor, probably 20 to 40 yards away. I prayed, for the first and only time, that it was a bear. The only other thing in those woods heavy enough to make that much noise would be an ungulate, which tend not to move so sporadically or loudly. My every muscle froze, as the intermittent creaking and snapping moved towards my camp. I held my knife to my chest like a cross, watching the moonlit side of my tent wall for a shape to take form. Then, after a light snap some 10 yards to my left, the woods went silent. I laid there, tense as a plank of wood, terrified to so much as breath. I stared at the shadows of the ferns and tree boughs that the moon cast against my tent wall, waiting for one of them to transform into the shape of the man and lunge. But no phantom assailant came. The shadows slowly lengthened and dissipated as the moon moved through the heavens up above. But I remained fixated on the bluish wall of my pup tent, counted breaths, and waited. It must have been hours before I dared to turn my head away from the direction of the snapping in the forest. The moon by that time had angled in the sky towards the other side of camp, and as I righted myself, I saw, on the opposite wall of my tent, the shadow of the man. He loomed above the canopy, perfectly still, perhaps just an arm's reach away. I was taken with panic, and in the wan late evening light, the silhouette's head turned ever so slightly, so as to look directly down at me. "Little Walker, I knew you'd get lost. Let me help you find the river." The man's voice had changed. It was no longer the masculine voice I had heard delivered in gravelly staccato on the trail earlier. It was vaguely feminine, sweet and melodic, every word dripping with acid. It was the voice that would come from a spider, if a spider could speak. And when I heard it, I knew I was going to die. "I'm not lost," I thought, or perhaps I whispered it. Either way, I remember it took all I had to make the words come. "I know where I'm going." At that, the man reached out and pressed his palm against the upper wall of the tent, imprinting a black handprint against the fabric. "If you are here, then you are lost," replied the voice from inside the man. And the lost belonged to me. The handprint against my tent spasmed, and I watched as the head of the silhouette convulsed and rolled back. Black shapes emerged from where the man's mouth was. Slender tendrils that twisted and unfurled upward from the man's throat, coiling and writhing in the air around his head, making a grotesque shadow puppet show out of the moonlit wall of my tent. In the terror of the moment, my impulse was to scream, but somehow, in the hot foam of fury and indignation that I should die at the will of this incomprehensible thing, the scream choked out in the form of words. "I am not lost." I surged up, and in a miraculously clean cut, sliced the tent's fabric from the canopy to the floor in the direction of the man's shadow. The hand pulled away and I sprang outward, blindly prepared to sink the Swiss Army knife into anything it might find purchase. But before I could clear my exit, I heard a man's "Hey yo" from the trees not far off camp. It was a deep, soulful bellow that rattled me and carried like wind around the evergreens and brambles. I knew the sound in my heart. It was Ronald's voice, the call he would make when we would hike together in the wilderness to ward off bears. Only now it came with such force that I felt it in and around me, a wave of feeling and a foghorn of sound. In that same moment, I heard the garbled, vicious words of the thing speak, I know not what, and by the time I was righted to my feet outside the tent, ready to attack, there was only silence. I scanned the shifty darkness of the woods, watching the trees and shadows around me like a hare watches the skies. My heart was pounding, my body still ready for the fight. But I was alone, no man, no silhouette, no creature, no Ronald. Just a woman alone in nature, panting through the adrenaline and fear. After some time I shook off my dread, stuffed my ruined tent back into my knapsack, retrieved my torch, and carefully picked my way back to the trail in the dark. From there I began the route again, holding my torch out like a night watchman, eyeing the tree line while being careful not to lose the beaten path. Occasionally I thought I heard movement far back behind me on the trail, but the light of my torch never caught anything in the shadows of the forest. A few miles later, daylight began to trickle through the canopy of the evergreens. An hour or so after that, I noticed the trees becoming smaller, farther apart, and the rush of the river in the distance became the soundtrack to my walk. By the time the trail rejoined the river, the woods were well behind me, and I soldiered on through open valley in a stupor. At some point I reached the meager town where I had left my car parked. By the time I realized I was walking on pavement, I was practically at town center. I am sure I drew disconcerted looks from the locals at the tap house when I staggered in, a mess of matted hair and sunken eyes, with my knapsack bulging and half-zipped. But I took no notice. It had always been my and Ronald's tradition after coming back out of the backcountry to celebrate with a bourbon and a beer. I ordered 2 of each, as I knew he had joined me for a final hike, but that it was on me to drink on his behalf. The barmaid took my order with the pouty indifference of someone who had served stranger orders to stranger patrons, and went to task. I had finished both bourbons and most of the second beer when a commotion broke me from the solitude of my thoughts. The excitement was directed at a tiny television mounted in a corner behind the bar, and the pouty barmaid turned up the volume at a request. It was the county news station, where a pallid man in a sports jacket was breaking a press release from the sheriff's office. The news ticker read, "Sheriff recovers body of drowned hiker." The camera cut to the sheriff explaining that the man was a hiker from Canada, who likely drowned while attempting to ford the river in the Valley Pass. He had been dead for 3 days before washing into town on the high river later that morning. Several bar patrons issued tuts and low whistles, the dirge of the cynical and unsympathetic, while the sheriff issued a tired warning that the river fording was dangerous, and not be attempted by those without proper training and experience. My thoughts went to the man, to the confident pilgrim of nature he must have been, perhaps too confident even, until a few days ago, when he got himself lost in some very old woods, where he weaved and wandered through the evergreens hunting for a trail, until something found him, something that took him to the river, where it takes all its lost travelers. But I was never lost. On the night of November 14, 2015, two Welsh brothers named Andrew and Mark Middle were out camping in the Clocaenog Forest in northern Wales. They were there to watch the 2015 Wales Rally, an annual off-road car racing event, about which both brothers were extremely enthusiastic. So enthusiastic, in fact, that they opted to camp out in almost sub-zero temperatures to maintain the perfect vantage point to watch the powerful vehicles hurtle past them. Given the cold, the brothers naturally needed to maintain a campfire to keep warm, and as anyone who has had to keep a campfire going overnight knows, it requires a lot of firewood. The brothers had collected an ample stack of dry kindling that afternoon, but as the night set in and a brisk November chill set in, they found their supplies of firewood dwindling. Apparently it was Mark's turn to go out and collect some, so he grabbed his flashlight, threw on his woolly gloves and hat, and set off into the pitch-black forest to gather firewood. It's more than likely that, given the time of year, the forest floor was very cold and damp during the night, and we can quite safely assume that Mark Middle's search for sufficiently dry kindling took him much further from his campsite than he would have liked. Then, before he knew it, all the trees started to look the same, and among the dense verdant foliage, he realized he'd lost sight of the warm glow of his campfire. Realizing he was lost, Mark called out to his brother, who immediately responded. Then all Mark had to do was follow the sound of his brother's voice, and he'd soon be back at camp. Yet the Clocaenog forest is so dense and wild in places that a few blind footsteps might send him crashing into the dirt below. So, to ensure this didn't happen, Mark shone his flashlight on the ground beneath him to make sure that he was clear of trip hazards. Back at camp, Andrew Middle was only mildly concerned about his brother calling out to him. Although it was very dark, Mark hadn't walked far, and he would most definitely be able to find his way back to camp from the sound of his voice. What followed was a variation on the famous pool game, Marco Polo. Mark would call out to Andrew, and Andrew would call back, until suddenly, Mark went quiet. Then, through the pitch darkness, Andrew quite clearly heard his brother, in a voice that sounded both astounded and horrified, say, "Oh my God." Andrew recognized the fear in Mark's voice immediately and asked his brother what the problem was. Mark stayed quiet for a second, staring in disbelief at the object at his feet, then called out to his brother, "I think you better come and see this." Andrew grabbed his own flashlight and rushed out to find his brother, white as a sheet, and staring at the ground. Andrew then looked down to see what he was looking at, then muttered his own exclamation of, "Jesus Christ!" Half buried in the earth, caked in moss and filth, was a human skull. Mark and Andrew quickly made their way back to their campsite and immediately contacted the police. Emergency services received the call at approximately 8:35 p.m., and by 9 that night, a local police officer had arrived at the scene to confirm the discovery. The officer was quickly followed by a forensics team who sequestered the area off before searching for additional human remains hidden just beneath the earth. The team discovered a complete human skeleton that they believed had been deposited there between the years of 1995 and 2005. It was only then that the Middle brothers were informed of something truly horrifying, that the ground they'd been camping on had once been used by notorious serial killer Peter Moore as a dumping ground for men he had murdered. They hadn't just pitched their tent on any old patch of forest, they'd made a camp on a veritable graveyard. What followed was a 5-week-long investigation that involved combing missing persons databases, pathological examinations, and intensive DNA profiling. It was determined that the man died from blunt trauma to the head, and that he had been murdered in an unknown location between 2004 and 2010. The victim was said to have been a well-built man in his 60s at the time of his death, standing between 5'8" and 5'10". Some items of clothing were found near the body, consisting of a dark green Pringle jumper and some dark red decomposed Marks and Spencer underwear, but it could not be confirmed that they were associated with the victim. Numerous attempts to identify the man via his DNA and teeth were unsuccessful, and in March of 2017, police confirmed that they had approached Peter Moore with questions regarding the man's identity. Moore claimed that the body did indeed belong to one of his victims, a 46-year-old mature student at Aberystwyth University, who had disappeared in 1996. Moore refused to reveal the victim's name, but journalists identified a Roger Evans of Bradley near Stoke-on-Trent as a mature student who had indeed gone missing in 1996. However, police later announced that this theory had been discounted due to conflicting dates, and to this day, the identities of both the victim and his murderer remain a complete mystery. However, the prevailing theory is that Peter Moore is indeed the man's killer and simply fed the police a string of false information in order to throw them off the scent. Moore was famous for claiming that his murders had actually been committed by a fictitious homosexual lover he nicknamed Jason, after the killer in the Friday the 13th movie series. He might have found a great deal of satisfaction in finally having deceived those that sent him to prison on a whole life order. The identity of Moore's apparently murderous lover was never uncovered, and despite jurors having decided that his claims were a complete fiction, they might have been very, very wrong. Moore was not only aware of someone who had gone missing in the year following his string of killings, but the victim was found mere yards away from where Moore's other victims had been found. There's a very good chance that Moore was indeed involved in the murder in some capacity, but if he didn't personally murder the victim, who did? Is it possible that Moore wasn't lying when he spoke of this Jason character? Is it possible that he'd been part of some kind of kill team back in 1995 when he committed his crimes? Or did the body simply belong to Moore's uncredited fifth victim, one his record will forever remain untainted by, thanks to a well-thought-out deception? As frustrating as it may be, these are questions that might never be answered, and with Moore rapidly approaching his 76th birthday, the time to get concrete answers is quickly running out. So next time you're camping and you're out collecting firewood, be careful where you tread. Instead of finding something to warm your bones, you might find something that will make your blood run cold. On April 5, 2017, 22-year-old Californian cyclist Jacob Gray set off from Washington State's Port Townsend, intent on cycling through the Olympic National Park. The bike he was riding was a specialized hard rock that some believed was slightly too small for Jacob. He was just an inch below 6 feet, yet the bike had sentimental value, as it was a promotional model that his father had won at a contractor's show raffle. Attached to the rear of the bike was a used red and yellow child trailer, one that Jacob had loaded with camping gear before setting off into the wilderness. Jacob was later sighted in Indian Valley and along Crescent Lake on April 5th. On the morning of April 6th, a woman drove past him as he rode down the Sol Duke Hot Springs Road. Later that afternoon she noticed his distinctive red and yellow trailer on the side of the road. It wasn't a good place to camp or stash a bike for long, as it was highly visible among the foliage. Jacob was nowhere to be seen. But little did the woman know, Jacob would never be seen again. A few hours later, his abandoned gear was found by park rangers, who noted something odd about the setup. A bow was lying on the ground next to the abandoned bike and trailer, and not only were arrows jammed into the dirt near the bike itself, but arrows seemed to have struck the red and yellow trailer, which held Jacob's possessions. The ranger in question, a man named John Bowie, then proceeded to search the immediate area, believing the bike's owner may have stopped in the nearby spring to collect water. But again, Jacob was nowhere to be seen. Bowie then contacted a fellow park ranger and asked him to recheck the area. The following morning, he expected the bike's owner to have returned to remove his gear, but the frame and trailer were still there on the morning of April 7th. A park ranger then searched Jacob's abandoned gear and found a list of phone numbers, which identified the gear's owner as Jacob. He then contacted one of the people on the list, who turned out to be Jacob's sister, Mallory. Once Jacob's parents were informed of his abandoned gear, the grave nature of the situation became clear. At that point, Jacob Gray officially became a missing person. The next day, the Clallam County Sheriff's Department combed over the area using around 30 different deputies and sniffer dogs to try to track down the missing cyclist. Even with all the manpower, they failed to locate him. A few days later, the Sheriff's Department enlisted the help of volunteer trackers from the Olympic Mountain Rescue. This team of dedicated specialists was much more adept at tracking the movements of missing people. As they searched, they made a series of curious discoveries. They found compelling evidence that someone, most likely Jacob, had swapped a pair of hiking boots for running shoes before walking to the edge of a nearby river. There they appeared to have slipped and fallen, leaving a distinct mark on a mossy rock. About 30 yards downstream, there were signs that this person had managed to pull themselves out of the river, eliminating the prospect that Jacob had drowned before being carried downriver. They doubled down on this theory by having team members search the log jams further down the river. But no trace of anybody was found, and the search continued. Yet despite the ongoing efforts, on April 14th, the status of the search for Jacob Gray was changed to that of a limited continuous search. This meant that rangers were no longer looking for a living person, as it was believed to be impossible for Jacob to have survived almost 2 weeks without protection from the elements. Search and rescue teams moved on to other tasks, leaving the search for Jacob to be headed up by volunteers only. This was extremely demoralizing for Jacob's family, but they refused to give up, and over the coming months, they personally organized at least a dozen searches of the Olympic National Park. Flyers were posted on park kiosks and gas stations in the Port Angeles area, and a team consisting of Jacob's friends and relatives handed out leaflets to people hiking through the park. This culminated in a huge 100-man search along the Sol Duque River in July of 2017. But only a pair of Burnside brand shorts, in Jacob's size, were recovered. A pair that matched an item he'd been given as a Christmas gift the previous year. This briefly renewed the family's hope of finding Jacob alive, but over the year that followed, the lack of any additional findings meant that the searches had to be scaled back, and a grim acceptance set in that they'd never see their beloved Jacob alive again. More than a year later, on Friday, August 10, 2018, a team of biologists ventured into the Olympic National Park to study marmots. They found themselves atop a ridge above Whole Lake, and it was there that they made a horrifying discovery. Along with his clothing, some of his gear, and his wallet, the team of scientists found what remained of Jacob Gray's lifeless body. This spot was more than 15 miles from where Jacob had abandoned his bicycle. So what exactly prompted the young man to abandon his things, before climbing up so far into the mountains? Despite the discovery of a bow and arrows near his abandoned bicycle, and after identifying Jacob via his dental records, a coroner argued that there was very little evidence of foul play. He had a cigarette lighter, insulated clothing, and plenty of food with him at the scene where the body was found. Yet, it was soon determined that the only rational explanation was that Jacob had somehow succumbed to hypothermia, as during the April he went missing, the terrain had been covered in a thick blanket of snow. However, this completely ignores the fact that Jacob's remains were little more than skeletal by the time they were found. There could have been any number of fatal wounds to Jacob's biodegradable tissues that would have been impossible to identify. It's also worth noting that when lost in the wilderness, most people know well enough to head downhill instead of climbing them. The last thing you want to do is end up stranded on a mountain when you could hike down to more temperate climates. But a person being pursued by someone or something might well climb up a mountainside in order to escape something chasing them, especially if that thing had previously fired at them with a bow and arrow. There's something else worth noting too, and that involves the items found in the vicinity of Jacob's skeletal remains. He was carrying a Bible with him. It seems when he abandoned his bicycle, he grabbed only what was completely essential for his survival: the lighter, the food, and the warm clothing. What would possess him to bring the Bible along? It's possible that he wished to use the pages as kindling, yet despite how badly degraded they were by the elements, the Bible's pages showed no signs of being ripped or torn. Just what was it about a Bible that Jacob saw as being essential to his survival? What was chasing him that he believed a holy text might be a salvation? There have been many that argued that Jacob's intention was to take his own life, and that carrying the Bible with him was an attempt to counterbalance the mortal sin that he perceived himself to be doing. But this raises the question: if Jacob intended on taking his own life, why bother bringing so much survival gear on a trip that would ultimately end in his death? It's entirely likely that Jacob wanted one last biking trip before going through with the act. But that theory completely ignores the fact that a bow and arrow were found at the site of his abandoned vehicle. It's not out of the question that Jacob brought these items along with him, and intended to use them as part of a survivalist-style exercise. Yet, if that was the case, why were arrows shot into the ground at an angle which would suggest they were being fired at Jacob? And if he was being attacked, he could have at least tried using the bow to defend himself. Only he didn't. Which leads us to believe that an attacker was wielding the bow. But what kind of psychopath stalks through the forests of Washington, hunting for human game? Who could have terrified Jacob so much that he'd have preferred to risk the freezing mountainside rather than risk walking back down into the woods? Did Jacob really get lost in the woods as some people contend? Or rather, was he stalked, attacked, and then chased up the mountain by someone who still walks among us today? From the very start, I was not a child of the city, of the concrete, or of the predictable paths of Lima's bustling streets. My first breath was drawn in the humid air of the Peruvian capital, yes, but my soul, my very essence, was carved out in the vast, untamed expanse of the Amazon jungle. My parents, both dedicated German biologists, had traded the sterility of lab work for the wilds of Panguana, a research station they established deep within the heart's shadow of the rainforest. Even as a toddler, I was more familiar with the calls of macaws and the chattering of tamarins than the sounds of cars and chatter of crowded marketplaces. My playground was the dense undergrowth. My playmates, the creatures and plants my parents studied. My father, Hans Wilhelm, taught me the language of the earth, soil under our feet, the intricate ecosystem we were part of. My mother, Maria, an ornithologist, taught me to look up, to observe the life that thrived in the canopy above, and to respect the delicate balance that kept it thriving. Life at Panguana was not just about survival. It was about living in consonance with nature. Every day brought new lessons that no conventional schoolroom could ever hope to impart. I learned to navigate the labyrinth of the jungle, not with a compass, but by reading the sun's position, the vegetation's density, and the river's flow. My father often said, "The jungle speaks to those who listen," and listen I did. I knew which plants could heal and which could harm, which berries were an invitation to dine and which were a forewarning of danger. My education was unconventional, sure. There were no blackboards, no rows of desks, no school bells to command the start and end of learning periods. Instead, there was the ever-changing environment around us, the constant cycle of life and death, growth and decay. My parents were strict, though, ensuring I wasn't just a child of the wild, but also equipped with the knowledge from books. They imported textbooks on math, science, and literature from Germany, and I studied by lantern light, the nocturnal sounds of the jungle a constant backdrop. As I grew older, the necessity of formal education beckoned me back to Lima. At 17, I returned to take my school's leavers exam at Lima's German school. The city was a stark contrast to my jungle home, its edges sharp, its smells acrid, its noises jarring. I missed the symphony of the Amazon, the scent of rain on leaves, the soft, forgiving earth underfoot. But I adapted, as I had been taught. I passed my exams with flying colors, my results a ticket back to my verdant sanctuary. Yet, as I prepared to leave the city once more, a part of me lingered over the sights from high-rise buildings, the buzz of electric lights, and the undeniable pulse of human innovation. On December 23, 1971, with my exams behind me and my future sprawling wild and green before me, I was ready to return. I was ready to go home to Panguana. Little did I know, as my mother and I boarded the plane back to our jungle, just how drastically our plans would change. We were flying on borrowed time, on wings not just of hope, but of impending fate. The morning was overcast as we made our way to the airport, the sky a heavy gray blanket that seemed to press down on the city of Lima. My mother was quiet, a rare solemnity about her that mirrored the unease clawing at my own insides. My father's warnings about Lanza, the airline notorious for its lax safety standards, echoed in my head. But our options were limited. It was the only way to get back to Panguana in time for Christmas. The plane was older, its interior worn and smelling faintly of mildew and stale air. As we ascended, the city fell away, replaced by the vast expanse of the Amazon. I pressed my face against the small window, watching the world transform below. My mother, perhaps sensing my unease, squeezed my hand. "It's just another adventure," she whispered, trying to infuse the moment with a levity I knew she didn't feel. Then, without warning, the adventure turned nightmare. About an hour into the flight, the aircraft shook violently. A deafening boom, like the sky itself splitting, reverberated through the cabin. Lightning. The pilots lost control and the plane began a sickening nosedive. Screams filled the air, a cacophony of terror that matched the roaring in my ears. I remember looking at my mother, her eyes wide with fear, and then, nothing but a blinding white flash. I awoke to a silence profound and unsettling. Disoriented, I found myself still strapped to my seat, miraculously intact amid the wreckage strewn across the jungle floor. The plane had disintegrated around us, scattering debris like a child's discarded toys. I was alone, utterly and terrifyingly alone. No sounds of rescue, no cries of other survivors, just the deep, omnipresent hum of the jungle. The realization that I was the sole survivor weighed on me with a crushing grief. My mother was gone, and with her, any semblance of the world I had known. But survival, my father's voice instructed, my mother's eyes implored, was paramount. I checked myself for injuries, a broken collarbone, cuts, bruises, and a deep gash on my arm that throbbed with the beat of my panicked heart. Drawing on the lessons of my childhood, I fashioned a sling from part of my seat cover, wincing as I maneuvered my arm into a less painful position. My first task was to find water, then shelter. Every step was agony, but the jungle, which had once been a playground, now presented itself as a labyrinth of potential threats and scarce resources. Days blended into a continuous loop of survival tasks. I found water in a stream, its coolness a small mercy. Food was harder to come by, but I managed to gather some fruits and nuts, mindful of the teachings on which plants were safe. Nights were the hardest. The darkness brought new sounds, menacing and close, and the pain of my injuries and the itch of insect bites made sleep a fleeting escape. Each day I pushed forward, driven by a singular need to survive, to honor my mother's memory by living. The skills my parents had instilled in me, once academic exercises, were now matters of life and death. I navigated through the dense foliage, avoiding natural hazards, each step a testament to the harsh lessons taught by the wild. I was a child of the jungle, yes, but never before had it demanded so much, or exacted such a painful toll. The 9th day dawned just as cruelly as the 8 before it, with the relentless sun filtering through the dense canopy, mocking my desolation. My body was a map of bruises and bites, my clothes tattered to shreds, and my spirit teetering on the edge. I stumbled through the undergrowth, my thoughts a chaotic whirl of pain and despair, when I broke into a small clearing and saw salvation, a missionary camp, deserted, but promising shelter and perhaps more. My heart surged with a mix of relief and anxiety as I approached the camp. The place was empty, left in a hurry, but it was stocked. I rummaged through the supplies, finding antiseptic, bandages, and, mercifully, a small cache of food. My first act was to tend to my wounds. The gash on my arm was infected, maggots thriving in the festering mess. The pain was blinding as I cleaned it with the antiseptic, each wipe a new level of agony. It wasn't enough. In a moment of desperation, I found a can of gasoline. I knew the risks, but the maggots had to go. Pouring the fuel over the wound, I screamed into the empty forest as the pain erupted, but the maggots writhed and died. Exhaustion overtook me, and I collapsed onto a cot, sleep enveloping me like a dark, silent wave. It was in this state of vulnerable slumber that the missionaries found me. I awoke to faces blurred by my disorientation, voices that seemed both alien and divine. They had returned to resupply, and instead found a barely alive jungle girl, a survivor against all odds. With efficient care and whispered prayers, they arranged for my evacuation. A helicopter churned the air above as I was hoisted aboard, the jungle receding below me, a tapestry of green that had been both a cradle and a crucible. The hospital in Lima was a blur of white walls and clinical smells, a stark contrast to the earthy tones of the jungle. My father was there, his face a canvas of relief and sorrow. We grieved together for my mother, for the life we had lost. My recovery was slow, marked by the physical scars that healed and the emotional ones that lingered. Driven by a need to confront the tragedy, I joined the efforts to locate the crash site. The government had organized search parties, and I guided them through the jungle, my intimate knowledge of the terrain proving invaluable. We found the wreckage, a graveyard of twisted metal and lost lives, including my mother's. The closure was painful yet necessary, her remains repatriated to Germany for a burial that was both an ending and a beginning. In the years that followed, I embraced my heritage, studying biology like my mother before me. I returned to Panguana, not just as a survivor, but as its steward, continuing the research my parents had devoted their lives to. The jungle had tested me, forged me, in its relentless crucible, and I emerged, not unscathed, but undeterred. Werner Herzog's film, Wings of Hope, later chronicled my ordeal, linking our fates, his decision to cancel his seat on that ill-fated flight, and my miraculous survival. It was a story of what-ifs and happenstances, a reminder of how closely life skirts the precipice of death, and how profoundly it can be altered by the simple twist of fate. Back when I was in university, I joined the Walking and Hiking Society. In stark contrast to its rather dull name, they organized some of the most exciting trips abroad the university had to offer. Every year, they organized trips to some of the best hiking spots in the world. During my second year, the destination happened to be the Carpathian Mountains. For those who don't know, the Carpathians run through several Central European countries, but the vast majority of them are in Romania. The Carpathians are home to some of the wildest forests in all of Europe, and are also home to rather frightening wildlife, including brown bears, wolves, and lynxes. Definitely creatures you wouldn't want to encounter during an early morning bathroom break. However, it wasn't the wildlife that made our Carpathians trip so creepy. It was a group of people we ran into after getting ourselves lost in the Rodney Mountains National Park. You're never really lost in the woods, not if you're a good enough navigator. If you have a map and a compass, some food and some water, you can always push on until you figure out where you are based on landmarks and whatnot. That's why, when the leader of our hiking group, a young professor we called George, said we might have taken a wrong turn down one of the trails, we weren't panicking. In fact, it felt quite exciting, thinking that we were venturing into the unknown. After all, you never improve your skills unless they're actually tested, and there's never any real growth without true discomfort. We knew we had to cross one particular mountain, and the key was finding this one particular mountain pass. As you can imagine, that's easy enough to do. All you have to do is find the spot where the mountains dip low enough, and Bob's your uncle, there's your way through. So it was simply a case of finding an elevated position, finding where the range dipped, then just orienting ourselves towards it. Easy peasy lemon squeezy, I thought. Then off we marched in the direction of the pass. There was just one little problem, and that was the issue of sustenance. Because we all focused on having an ultralight kit, we'd taken minimal food and water with us, planning to stop off at various little villages along the route to take on supplies. Given that we'd missed one of our village stops due to getting ourselves a bit lost, we ended up running out of our substantial food supplies. This wasn't a huge problem, as we still had a few cereal bars and glucose gel packs to keep us going, and finding fresh water from mountain streams was surprisingly easy. But on the day before we planned to navigate the pass, we were all starting to feel pretty hangry as a result of the shortage. At one point, we all decided to take a break, while George and another member of the group decided to scout the area to see if they could find any sources of food, wild or otherwise. About 2 hours after they departed, they returned with some good news. They'd spotted what looked like a small village up in the mountains, one that wasn't on our maps, but was definitely populated, as there was smoke coming from various chimneys. The plan was to show up, be very polite, and offer them some cash in exchange for whatever food they could give us. We didn't care if we had to pay over the odds for it. We were that hungry, and would have paid triple the going rate for a decent hot meal. So that was all it took to get us moving again. And with the promise of full stomachs, we found ourselves with renewed energy to walk a few miles up to the mountain village. It was definitely a bit nerve-wracking. I mean, what if they weren't friendly or just straight up refused to sell us anything despite us offering them a fistful of cash? If we took the gamble and it didn't pay off, we'd have a terrible time crossing the mountain pass. A person can go a long time without food, and we had enough water to last us. But we'd definitely be in a bad way once we got to the next village after the pass. Passing out from hunger is bad enough at the best of times, but pass out and tumble down the mountainside, and that could be the end of you. So you can imagine how elated and grateful we were when we reached the village, and they were actually quite welcoming to us. I say quite, because as much as the bloke we offered money to seemed over the moon to have us trudge into his village, some of the other villagers seemed less than impressed by our presence. I really don't mean this to sound too mean or ungrateful because they literally saved our butts out there, but a lot of them just didn't look right, if that makes sense. I wouldn't have been surprised if there was a bit of inbreeding going on, to put it that way, and some of them had this faraway glassy look in their eyes like there wasn't too much going on between their ears, if you get my drift. So, as much as we were happy to be eating some proper food for the first time in like 24 hours, we were quite keen on getting out of there too. We were offered goat milk and goat meat, a few baked potatoes, pretty basic food like that, and my God did it taste amazing, even with what little seasoning they used. After that, we spent about an hour just relaxing and digesting with full-on food babies, until we realized, in a bit of a panic, that sunset was fast approaching. But then, when it came to asking the village headman to help us find the mountain pass, he casually refused, and kept making hand gestures that we interpreted as tomorrow, or in the morning. A quick show of hands showed that almost no one was focused on bedding down in the village overnight. And given that some of the other girls complained that some of the village boys had been giving them some rather unsavory looks, they'd rather take their chances camped out on the mountainside than stay in the village overnight. And given how we could literally hear wolves howling on the preceding nights, that was really saying something. So that's how we ended up packing up our gear, thanking the village head guy after giving him a big chunk of change, and heading off into the twilight to find somewhere to camp. Once we walked a fair distance away from the village, we all started setting up our little tents and whatnot, got a few fires going, and after warming ourselves and laughing about the close call we had, we all tried to get some sleep before the busy day ahead of us. We really did need to get all the sleep we could get, as traversing the mountain pass was going to be a heck of a lot of work, even with the food in our bellies. It turns out no one would get any decent sleep on account of the visitor we received in the middle of the night. I remember being shaken awake by the girl I was sharing a tent with, who told me in this really shaky, scared voice to put my boots on. The next thing I know, I can hear George, the professor leading our group, calling out to someone. He was saying things like, "Do you speak English? Are you from the village? We're leaving in the morning and we don't want any trouble." Whoever he was talking to wasn't saying anything back, and it was around then that I put my boots on and stuck my head outside of the tent to see if I could get a look at the person, only it wasn't just one person. It was about 4 or 5 different people standing on a rise above our campsite, shining flashlights down onto us. At least I think it was only that many, because that's how many torches they were shining down on us. There could have been a lot more that we couldn't see. We didn't know who they were, or what their intentions were. We had no idea if they were from the village or not, if they intended to rob us and take the rest of our money, or something even worse. Like I said, there were a few of the village boys who seemed to have taken an unhealthy liking to some of the girls in our group, and my own personal worst fear was just that they'd found our camp and were intent on dragging one or two of us away for, you know what. Thankfully, a few of the guys came out of their tents to see what was going on. The torches switched off, and we heard the sound of boots on rocks, then silence, meaning whoever it was had retreated, and we all breathed this collective sigh of relief. But like I said, sleep didn't come easy after that, and that's if you were able to get any sleep at all. At first light, we packed up our things and headed off in the direction of the mountain pass. It was seriously tough on next to no sleep, but thankfully the food in our bellies and the fear in our chests motivated us sufficiently to make it all the way to the other side by the early afternoon. We were all elated by the time we made it across and down onto the lush green fields on the other side. It was like a little slice of paradise right before our eyes, and the best thing was we could clearly see quite a large village just a mile or two away, one that would certainly have access to food and, more importantly, alcohol. I personally needed a strong one after the day we'd had, and luckily, there was a small bar in the village square that was only too happy to provide us with these big bottles of plum brandy they called palinka. The owner of the bar was quite proficient in English too, which certainly made our lives easier, and he ended up asking us about our trip. Obviously, one of the first things we told him about was our run-in at the mountain village, and how it started out as a rather nervy encounter that turned into a seriously creepy midnight confrontation. When we told him, he gave us this rather bemused look before telling us that we must have been confused. According to him, there were no villages around the mountain pass, and that they'd all been demolished during the communist era, with the occupants being moved on to collective farms. We all sort of gave each other these funny looks as if to say, well, that can't be right, before informing him that he was mistaken. If the government had deported all those mountain people, it looked like they'd moved right back up there as soon as the Iron Curtain fell, so to speak. The conversation then moved on to us asking why the government had done something so cruel as to deport entire villages away from their homes, and shockingly, the bar owner seemed to have very little sympathy for them. He launched off into some speech about it being the best thing for them, how they were all illiterate, and they needed to be dragged kicking and screaming into the modern world. We thought this was a bit harsh, honestly. I mean, everyone is entitled to live the way they want to. At least that's the way I see it. But he disagreed. He said if we knew the truth about what they did up there, we wouldn't be so sympathetic. Then, without a hint of jest or hyperbole to his words, he tells us that they're cannibals, and that they eat the weakest of their own number in order to conserve resources. Not only that, but they steal the breast milk of their pregnant women to distribute among the men of the village. That's when one of us piped up that one of the first things they shared with us was meat and milk. Of course they'd claimed it was goat milk, but none of us had ever drunk it before, so how would we know the difference? The man looked absolutely horrified when we told him this, then promptly walked away from our table before disappearing behind the bar. Our group looked equally horrified, at least until a few of the older members spoke up that the bloke was either seriously misinformed, horrifically bigoted, or was just playing some elaborate joke on us that he could share with his regulars for a good old laugh. This one guy named Adrian was saying something like, there was absolutely no chance that they were a bit backwards but cannibals, no bloody chance. And I'm very much inclined to agree with him on that. We were in Romania, not some random isolated island, and given the grinding poverty they were suffering, it was almost an impossibility that they'd share anything as precious as milk with us, even if they were bloody paying. After all, there were tons of goats trotting around the village, plenty of females with swollen udders too, so I can almost categorically say that we didn't engage in cannibalism, nor did we drink any of the women's milk, so to speak. The only thing that really still scares me to this day is the gang of mysterious people who we encountered, the ones who shone torches down on us from the ridgeline above. No one with any innocent intentions just rolls up on a camp of sleeping people like that. They didn't say a word to us, didn't greet us in Romanian, and you'd think they'd at least say something to us to ensure their good intentions, even if it was in a language we couldn't understand. After all, it's all in the tone of voice, and not so much exactly what you're saying. It makes me wonder what would have happened if there hadn't been so many of us, if it had been just all girls, or the lads hadn't come out of their tents for an unintentional show of force. Sometimes I don't think they were just curious about us. Sometimes I think that they had something very, very bad in mind for us, and we're all extremely lucky that they didn't go ahead with whatever they were planning. I don't think it was the nicer guy who fed us either. I don't think it had anything to do with him. I think it was the younger lads who had been ogling the girls in our group, and I think they'd have been monsters given half the chance. All in all, it was a wonderful trip, just one that was slightly marred by a rather unpleasant nocturnal encounter. The people we met in Romania were, for the most part, some of the kindest, most welcoming people one could ever wish to meet. But there were a small few, and I say this in no uncertain terms, that might have done things to us that meant we never made it home alive.